Ditch those clowns and jokers. Join me in the middle with your independent minds. All you've got to do is click the subscribe button and ring that little bell, and you'll then get the most independent presentations on all of YouTube. Thanks for watching.
I've said previously that the forces that elected Donald Trump would outlast Donald Trump. It always seemed to me that this was not a Trump-centric phenomena. And for me, what caused me to say that was really Brexit, which preceded the election of Donald Trump. That's when there was a demonstrative sign there that there was something afoot, not just in the UK and not just in the United States, but indeed globally. And now with expertise backing him up that I lack, a really great analysis of this subject posted at Smerconish.com and consequently in all of my social media right now under the headline, Trump was a symptom, not the disease, and it's become a global pandemic. The author is Dr. Jack Goldstone, who is the Hazel Professor of Public Policy and an eminent scholar at George Mason University and joins me now. Thank you so much, Dr. Goldstone. This piece is really great.
I just tried to tell people what's happening. Thank you, Michael.
So let's talk about some of the background. You say there's something ailing democracy and it is global. What is it?
It's really a failure of the Western democratic liberal governments to deliver for their entire populations. And the whole promise of democracy is that ordinary people can do well and that elites cannot dominate them. That's what democracy is supposed to be about, one person, one vote. And yet for the last 20 to 30 years, even the leading democracies of the West, we've had a situation where the rich have gotten richer and everybody else has lagged behind. So people are losing faith in democracy and looking for leaders who promise to do more.
When you speak of liberal elites, you don't mean the effete in Marin County, right? You mean something different.
No, I'm pointing a finger at myself as well. I think a lot of intellectuals, academics on both the left and the right. This was true of Bill Clinton, Tony Blair, George Bush, W. Bush. Leaders for decades kind of had assumed that Cold War was tilting in favor of the United States. So capitalism was a good thing and we could let it rip. We assumed that the age of the internet was going to go along. And we kind of thought we were riding this great wave of democracy that would make everything good. It would make China liberal and pro-Western. It would make the internet a safe space for democratic dialogues. And we were just wrong about those things. And we liberal intellectual elites, weren't paying attention to things like the rising death rate among white males in both America and Britain.
If you were to establish a timeline for the rise of global authoritarianism, as you're defining it and explaining it in this essay, what would be some of the milestones? Brexit, I'm sure, would be a milestone, but where would you begin and what else would you reflect?
Well, it's kind of like tidal forces pulling things slowly into place and then the wave breaks. So it's hard to put a finger on the milestones. Certainly already in the 1980s, as communism was collapsing, we were starting to see a kind of Western hubris about all the great things that we were doing. And some of that was perfectly justified, but it didn't mean that we could kind of assume that the plane of democracy would keep on flying, even if the engines started to bellow some smoke and we lost altitude. But we kind of assumed everything would be okay. So milestones I'd pick out are obviously the collapse of the Soviet Union, which launched this kind of unipolar moment in which the US felt overly empowered. 9/11, which showed our vulnerability, and then our overreaction in the next few years by sending expeditionary forces both to Afghanistan and Iraq. And not just for a kind of brief punitive effort, but for military occupations, as if we'd learned nothing about the do not get involved in land wars in Asia lessons of the earlier decades. Other key turning points are when Vladimir Putin decided he could do without the approval of the world and would go ahead and seize the Crimea. When Xi Jinping in China decided he could depart from the succession rules that had been put in place by his predecessors and essentially commit himself to being leader of the Communist Party and China for life. These were kind of global markers that the autocrats had gotten bolder. They were now confident. They didn't have to hide behind a facade of democracy to the same degree. And in the United States, I think the election of Donald Trump was kind of the confirmation that the traditional politics were being discarded and that people were hungry for some different new kind of leadership. And since then, probably January 6th, showing how far ordinary Americans were willing to go to carry out their attacks against their own government. And that's where we are today.
You say it's remarkable how widely the virus of nationalist authoritarianism has spread. And then further along, the list of such leaders is long and growing. Name some names. Who are we talking about?
Well, you mentioned Brexit. So Nigel Farage, the leader of Brexit, although he chose not to run for political power, handed off his baton to Boris Johnson. They formed a populist nationalist wave in Britain, pulled them out of the EU. Obviously, Trump here, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, Maduro, Venezuela, Duterte in the Philippines, I think Modi now in India, and of course, they join Putin in Russia, Xi in China, Viktor Orban in Hungary, even possibly Keiko Fujimori now, who is contesting the election in Peru and calling it illegitimate. And there are other kind of aspirational nationalist authoritarian leaders like Marine Le Pen in France.
And the common denominator of each of those that you've named is what?
They believe that a program of putting their nation's interests first and not cooperating with other countries and international organizations is the best way to look out for national interests. They tend to be strongly opposed to immigration and granting any support or favors to immigrants or foreigners. They have a program that kind of looks backward rather than forward. They kind of want to go back to a 1940s or 1950s type world when we were much less connected and every country relied on itself. I don't think it's appropriate for the world we're in going forward. We've just seen what happens in a global pandemic. It's precisely the countries that had the most nationalist populist leaders, the US, Brazil, you could add Erdogan in Turkey, Russia, Johnson in the UK. These are precisely the countries that did worst in coping with the pandemic, in large part because they encourage distrust of government and distrust of international institutions, and a belief that, oh, we'll be fine if we just stick to our guns and manage things by ourselves.
So some on that list are not the beneficiaries of a true democracy, right? I mean, Vladimir Putin is really not where he is because he's been elected by the Russian people. But those who are, I find, and you touch on some of this in this great essay, are beneficiaries of very strange bedfellows where, for example, you've got the haves and have-nots, the very wealthy who you describe as being along for the ride, and people who are part of the populist core of this movement who are on the outside looking in, and yet they're on the same side politically. Why?
Well, the genius of populist nationalism is it does bring together groups that historically have not been politically aligned. And it does so on the basis of kind of a lowest common denominator of an aggressive nationalist interest. It's really identity politics. And if you can convince people to embrace this particular identity, us against the world, us for what we always used to be, you can pull a lot of people together. That's why I think people underestimate this movement if they simply see it as a result of, oh, we had an apprentice celebrity TV leader elected, and once he's gone, this will go away. That's not at all true, and it's not going away even in the United States. But the strange bedfellows are also international. One of the key elements of this movement is what happens in one country affects what happens elsewhere. So as Putin gets stronger, he's able to better support the authoritarian Lukashenko in Belarus. As Xi Jinping gets stronger, he's able to support authoritarians in Cambodia, Venezuela, wherever else China wants to get engaged. And the example of democracy's failures in the United States and in Europe empower would-be autocrats in Africa, the Middle East, and elsewhere.
To seize the autocratic leadership mantle, do you need to have a charismatic person? In other words, you've convinced me. I was already of this belief, but now with the data and the analysis, Dr. Jack Goldstone has convinced me that there is a worldwide move afoot that threatens democracy and favors what's the word I'm searching for?
Authoritarian leaders?
Authoritarian leaders, right. But in order to fill that void and to seize that position, must you have Trump-like characteristics? In other words, assume, Dr. Goldstone, that he doesn't run in 2024, but that all these component parts that you've described are there. Must someone possess a special skill set to make it happen, or is it there for the asking? Can a Ron DeSantis necessarily follow in his footsteps? Can Ted Cruz, can Rand Paul, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, I don't think Ted Cruz or Rand Paul can. They don't have the kind of credibility, it seems. But Ron DeSantis seems to be picking up steam. And Marjorie Taylor Greene has enthusiastic crowds wherever she goes. And even before Trump, we saw Sarah Palin command a significant wing of the Republican and conservative independents. What matters is not the charisma of an individual, but the cohesion of a media movement. I think Trump is not Trump without Fox News and Hannity and Breitbart and Steve Bannon. There were a lot of pieces put in place to help make Trump not just a jovial and entertaining figure, but a compelling political leader. And we see that around the world. The skills in manipulating social media, in manipulating television, in creating an image are skills that can be learned, and they're being picked up and spread among would-be autocrats around the world. Now, it's not automatic. I don't think there's a magic formula. For example, in France, Emmanuel Macron did better than Marie Le Pen at seeking to pick up all the disaffected who did not want to follow the mainstream parties in France. In the United States, we have kind of the same thing with Bernie, the socialist from Vermont, picking up a very large following, and in large part because people are disgusted with mainstream politicians. It's been kind of a wonder that Joe Biden has been able to keep popularity above 50% simply by going back and kind of plowing the mainstream. So it's not automatic. You don't necessarily have to have charisma, but we're seeing around the world this kind of collision course between the autocrats who are building a media empire to try and solidify a narrow nationalist viewpoint and get identity followers on their side. And in response, we're seeing more traditional politicians trying to mount a response based on policy, trying to show, hey, government actually can do good things. Government can make your life better. And that's the side I hope will prevail, because I think that's where democracy has to go to return to full strength.
Final question, and we're not giving it all away. I want people to read this and make their own assessment, but what is required for a course correction?
The points I just made about restoring trust in government is part of it. I think people also have to extend each other a little more understanding and dignity. It's true on both the right and the left. It's been terrible the way left elites have kind of been disdainful and really just insulting to a lot of ordinary people who they think are not seeing the world the way they do. And the same is true of conservatives and Republicans who are using language like traitor, threat to the American people, about institutions, Congress, the media, that have been the core of democracy in this country. So I think toning down the rhetoric, getting people to know each other, actually a proposal for national service is a great idea in all countries so that ordinary people learn to work side by side. So there's a lot that needs to be done.
Absolutely agree. That was excellent. The essay is excellent. I really appreciate your analysis, and I thank you so much for both writing what you wrote and your willingness to come by and discuss it further.
Pleasure to talk to you, Michael.